the Triathlon Show 394. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode we have part 2 of my interview with Michele Zanini. If you missed part 1, don't worry, you do not necessarily have to listen to these 2 parts in order because we cover specific topics within each. I do recommend that after you finish listening to this episode today, you go back and listen to part 1 because there's a lot of really interesting stuff and information in that one as well. In today's episode, in part 2 here, we discuss strength training for endurance performance and Michele's work with legendary running coach Renato Canova, including going through some of the main Canova training principles. And in last week's episode, we discussed Michele's work as a physiologist and strength and conditioning coach within the Italian Triathlon Federation, as well as the science of running economy and durability. But before we get into part 2 of this interview, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. They help athletes perform at their best with electrolyte and fueling products and with free online tools, education, and a patented sweat test. You can use the free fuel and hydration planner on their website to get a personalized plan for your carbohydrate, sodium, and fluid intake. And you can also book a free 20-minute video consultation to chat through your plan with the athlete support team. I have used their entire range of products for a long time, and I think they are absolutely brilliant. And you can get 15% off your first order by using the code TTS23 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 indoor swim trainer allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency, even when you're short on time. It is a great tool for busy athletes because you can do a quality workout in just 15 minutes at home, even on days when you don't have time to get to the pool. And it is the perfect complement to pool and open water swimming because it allows you to focus specifically on certain key aspects of your swimming, like your catch and your power, and isolate them more easily than you could in the water. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days, so if you don't love it, just send it back, and you can get 20% off your first order on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, here's part 2 of my interview with Michele Zanini. And about that study that you talked about that is not yet published, can you give an overview of the type of strength training, the protocol that was used there, and then maybe from there we can move into more general thoughts on strength training and how you use it also within the applied performance setting that you're working in?
Yeah, of course. For the strength protocol, we've had two sessions per week, about 1 hour each for 10 weeks, and we aim to improve plyometrics, where we implemented plyometrics exercises. So there were, I think, 2 plyometric exercises each session, and maximum strength for the lower limbs. So for the details, we had full squats, leg press, single leg press, and isometric calf raise. And that's coming from another study that they've recently done in Germany, for which via isometric calf raises they managed to improve the energy cost of running by about 4%. That was basically like, thinking, well, actually the muscle fibers in the calf, they act quite isometrically during running because most of the work is done via the tendon. So shall we try to do that in training and see how that influences the outcome from a running perspective afterwards?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And you as a strength and conditioning coach, how do you view it? Maybe if we start with triathlon, let's say when you're advising the Italian athletes, what are your general thoughts on how you want to see it implemented in that setting?
Yeah, from an applied perspective, it does get quite different because you have with research you have the constraints of making sure that everything is standardized and the athletes, they basically just do the work instead of learning exercises. So there's no chance to really progress much. There's no chance to periodize as much. With athletes outside of research settings, you have, plans that they probably start from 6-7 months onwards. With the athletes I work with, I tell them, well, we really want to start thinking about improvements that they can be developed over a year or more, because otherwise it just gets too cramped up. But yeah, as for what I try to do and how I try to implement it, it's first of all trying to think about the races they have and plan around that. So periodize the strength training based on that. So one of the errors I see around is that athletes sometimes they just keep repeating the same exercises every time they go to the gym, and maybe that is helpful for injury prevention perspective, but not necessarily for a performance enhancement perspective. I always give the example of well, you're always doing the same in the gym, but you don't do always the same in your aerobic exercises. You don't go for the same ride every week. You don't go for the same run every week. So that's a bit the insight that I try to give them at the beginning when we start working together, or even just like when I give insights to the coaches. You have different targets that you want to enhance throughout the season. As for the goals or just like type of strength that we want to develop, from the evidence, you got plyometrics, maximal strength, and explosive strength that they tend to improve performance, not only running economy or fatigue development, but also maximal sprinting speed and potentially speed at VO2 max due to improvement in running economy. And you really don't have any decrease in other parameters. So that is something quite it's worth pointing it out, because a lot of people they are afraid of losing fitness, get slower, whatever may be, when they implement strength training. But the evidence tells you, well, you're not getting bigger. So I think Rich Blagrove did review a few years ago about it, and out of 24 studies, 22 they didn't find any change in body mass. You don't get slower at all. If anything, you get faster. And that argument it's easily taken off by looking at what type of work the sprinters do. Sprinters, they have to be very fast, but that's basically their aim, and they still do a lot of strength training. But then, the implementation, it's a bit more tricky, because I believe one of the issues with endurance sports is that you either have the endurance coach that tries to implement some strength training without really knowing how to implement it, because he doesn't have the time to look into strength training resources and basically the physiological adaptations that you can have. And they may just get the target wrong, the volume, the weight, the type of exercises, and so on. And on the other hand, you may have strength coaches that they try to support endurance athletes, but sometimes they get the approach of power athletes or just more strength-oriented sports, and volumes are much higher because the ceiling for adaptation for more power-trained athletes is lower, and therefore after 3 or 4 sessions, the athletes don't feel like doing it anymore because they always sore, or if they keep on doing it, they keep having that soreness, which really creates issues with everything else from a aerobic perspective in the main sports, or running or triathlon or cycling, whatever it is. Just make sure first of all to avoid creating soreness to the athletes, and then as we said before, just try to see where the athletes and the coach you're supporting are at the moment, and build from there. I don't think there's like a framework for which I go, we do this and that and that and that. Is more about meeting the group I'm supporting where it is, and then moving from there towards a goal from a long-term perspective.
With creating soreness, do you think that that's more related to, or is it related simply just to the overall load, so weight times repetitions, or is it more related to one than the other? Say, is the number of repetitions more likely to cause soreness, or is it more the weight that you're lifting? That could be a useful I guess, rule of thumb, if there is one, for the listeners to be aware of.
Yeah, I think it's related to the volume, first of all. Of course, soreness comes primarily from eccentric damage. So basically what happens is your fibers, they tear when you exercise, and then, when you do strength training, and then you've got a response, an inflammatory response, and a supercompensation to create stronger fiber, bigger fiber as you're recovering. So I think that's fine for a couple of sessions, or it can even be a bit more, maybe at the very beginning of the period when you're away from races. But then when you maybe changing the target, let's say from maximal strength to power, you may get, again, 1 day or 2 days where the athletes feel slightly sore the day after. But then after that, you really want to avoid that, primarily when you're around the racing season. So I think with endurance athletes, I always try to go, if anything, too little than too much, because they got an exposure to something that they've never done. So even if they're elite athletes, they've never really done heavy lifting, or they've never really done plyometrics, and being exposed to that for the first time, it will create an adaptation regardless of suboptimal volume. And plus, the ceiling of adaptation, as we said before, it is far higher than power sports or strength dominant sports. So let's say a power athlete can be at 95% of their maximal capacity within that strength outcome. An endurance athlete can be at 80, 75. I'm just throwing numbers here, but it gives you an idea. You basically don't need as much work to improve compared to power athletes. So volume, I think it's the one that needs to go down. You can't really play too much with intensity, because you want to get that specific adaptations due to the load. So there's a little bit of mixed evidence at the moment about the optimal load for hypertrophy and maximal strength and so on. But let's say that we can stick to over 80% of 1 RM max, so the load that you can lift with one repetition, and you want to aim for some exercises that they have a load of over 80% of it for improvement of maximal strength. And then I always suggest the athletes to do it with maximal intent. So the speed of the lift is also important. Basically, even if your lift is submaximal, so let's say 70 or 60% 1 RM, if you do it as fast as you can, you're still activating more fibers, and more fibers are working, and therefore you will have an adaptation on more fibers than just performing it controlled. So yeah, I wouldn't compromise intensity, but definitely lower the volume. And the other thing is just keep the sessions relatively brief. I wouldn't go over 1 hour. Most of the time, 50 minutes is fine. Sometimes you may stretch because you have an extra exercise to work on from a prehab perspective, or you're learning some new exercises and these sort of things. But yeah, usually 50 minutes is more than enough to do everything. And if you need to cut off something, you may just want to remove one exercise. Don't cut recovery. So that's one of the other things that endurance athletes and coaches tend to do. It's just like getting the strength work as a repeats workout. Okay, 115, 130, let's go. Where with strength training physiologically is different. You need that 2.5 minutes to replenish the phosphocreatine to produce force and power efficiently again. And if you cut it, it just won't be as effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you have any rule of thumb for how many reps to failure or from failure the athletes should lift. So that's something that you hear a lot of advice about in terms of leave 1 rep in the tank or leave 2 to 3 reps in the tank. What is your rule of thumb?
I remember listening to Ben Tronestad a few weeks ago on your podcast about this, and he said that he doesn't really leave any because the room of adaptation for athletes, for endurance athletes, is so high that they're very far from their max anyway, which makes sense. And I may push it a little bit myself, thanks to that advice. But at the moment I leave it to, let's say, it really depends on the target. But let's say if you're within the maximal strength realm, so let's say up to 5-6 reps, you may go for 2 reps in reserve. So if you can do 5, you're going to do 3. If you're more towards the general strength / hypertrophy phase, maybe at the beginning, you can leave 2 to 3. So let's say you can do 10, you do 7 or 8. But besides the fact that you want to leave some reps in the tank just to avoid that soreness and that not maladaptation, but like excessive load, it also goes to the safety side of it, because the closer you get to your limit, the less precise your movement will be. So I try to keep exercises with free weights, so barbells and maybe dumbbells. I rarely use leg presses or other guided machines. So you want to make sure that the safety is there. And another thing about volume, it may not only be the volume of that single set, but the overall volume of the exercise. So instead of 4 sets, you may do 2 sets in some parts of the season. And volume as exercises. So instead of having 3 leg exercises, you may just do 2, for example.
Yeah. And you mentioned working a lot with plyometrics and weights, lifting relatively heavy. I'm not saying that you do that all the time necessarily, but those are parts of the strength training that you implement, and that's obviously what we, as you have talked about, see in the literature generally when it comes to the type of strength training that improves endurance performance. However, if you maybe have heard interviews that I've done with, for example, Matt Pendola quite recently, and also Erin Carson towards the end of last year, my interpretation of those interviews, at least, is that they take a slightly different approach with more focusing on, let's say, form, mechanics, not so much on going heavy. Matt Pendola, for example, talked a lot about using banded exercises and so on. What's your take on that? Do you implement those sorts of things as well? And what is your opinion on completely or mostly leaving out anyway the heavy strength in favor of just those sort of, let's say, form-based biomechanical exercises?
Yeah. I've listened to the podcast with Matt recently as well, and it seems to be something that, there are a fair few people working with endurance athletes that they do that, like avoiding heavy lifting, or power dominant exercises or plyometrics in favor of form, in favor of prevention, and so on. So I think I'm coming to a point to believe that there's like the strength coaches coming from strength and conditioning that they know how to improve performance and how to optimize that. And then there are more conditioning / physio coaches with a physio background, so physiotherapy background, that they aim more to have that prevention lenses towards strength training. You need both, certainly, and I don't do optimal job with prevention, I think, just because I'm not a physiotherapist. So if I need to work on that side for a specific problem or try to prevent some potential issue that may happen with the athlete, I may talk with the physiotherapist of the athlete or of the federation, and we work together with that. So I think that's very important, and again blends into the teamwork that I was mentioning before. But I come primarily from the strength for endurance to enhance performance. And as far as I can tell, I can't remember any reference that mentions, I don't know, core training or flexibility or just working on accurate technique enhances performance. Well, that's, of course, a limitation of research, once again, because protocols, they tend to be 2-3 months long, maybe. So 8 to 12 weeks, let's say. And you probably have the effect of these type of work that they take longer to develop. So I can't tell which one would be best. I come from that strength dominant spectrum, but yeah, I try to implement the prevention side as well, and that's definitely important, because you want the athlete to be able to just perform their running or just general aerobic exercise consistently. And if you don't get the prevention side in, you might just risk to overload some specific tissues. But yeah, besides some slightly basic exercises or progressions that I developed over time, I don't have the capacity and knowledge to focus my program on that, really.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And what I'm thinking, maybe tell me what you think about these thoughts. But we know from the literature that the basic exercises with some like decent intensity, repeated consistently over 8 to 12 weeks or even or more if you can, that tends to work really well for a lot of endurance athletes. For the majority of them, you see a good improvement in economy, for example. With let's say focusing more on moving away from the heavier weights and focusing on form-based exercises, I think that can it makes sense if you're there with the athlete, or at least you can see them virtually and you can really assess the individual, like what exactly is it that you need to work on, where are you limited. You can work on a very specific thing, but it's probably a lot harder, if not impossible, to make that kind of program work a bit more, let's say, generically across the board with athletes, because athletes might have so individual limitations in their movement quality and so on. That's at least where my mind goes when I'm comparing these two approaches.
Yeah, no, exactly. And well, still with the lifts, you want to make sure that the movement is there, first of all. So if you need to regress the exercise or do something easier because the athlete is not able to do a deadlift or a full squat because of some motor control limitation or just like anatomical limitation or flexibility limitations or anything related to that, you just regress that to keep it more simple. But yeah, I try to keep the focus on the weight and the capacity of the athlete to produce high level of power, really. But yeah, form comes first. So when you start working with athletes that they new to strength training, the first part of it is just try to assess the movement and make sure that they can perform the movement safely and you target the right muscles. Because if you just do something which is even slightly different, you may activate muscles differently, and that increases the risk of injuries as well as creates a suboptimal adaptation due to the activation of different muscles compared to the target.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm aware that we have already exceeded our calendar slot. Do you have time still, so we can go into some of the questions related to run training and working with Renato Canova and so on? Or
yeah, don't worry, carry on.
Perfect. So yeah, let's start with that one. You mentioned having worked with Renato Canova. How has he and working with him influenced your view on running and run training and endurance training in general?
Yeah, I mean, basically the person I looked for when I started prescribing training. So with that, basically he wrote a book probably in 1999 or 2000, something like that. And I read it, and it was the first one that actually gave me some good methodological steps to follow for training prescription with specific examples and like frameworks to develop your own training programs. And then from there, followed up on everything that he wrote on letsrun.com. So he was used to write a lot on that blog. He's probably doing it still, not as much, but it was just to post every workout or workouts that people were asking about his athletes and his view of A, B, C. So, the type of training for marathon or type of training for middle distance running and so on. So got really into that. And then eventually I managed to get to meet him at a conference, asked him a few things. I've already been in Kenya back then with another coach for an internship. And I said, well, I may be able to come back. And he was like, oh, let me know. So eventually I met him in Italy during the training camp that he was having with Sondre Moen, a Norwegian marathon runner that I don't know if he had the European record, but he ran 2:05:45 that season. And I think it was before the super shoes. So quite remarkable performance. But yeah, basically just get the chance to be with him for a couple of days, and then from there just consistently been with him in Italy, and then he had the training camp in Kenya, and I could go with him and start supporting part of the work that he's been doing with strength training. One remarkable thing about Renato is that he's extremely passionate about what he does, so athletics. And the first time I met him, we had the session with the athlete the first day, and then the second day we just spent it talking about training and application of it, or athletics in general. And we spent at his house 5 straight hours talking about running, and I was just taking notes and just sitting there listening with no breaks, no food, no water, nothing. And eventually I had to leave because I had to coach. But yeah, that gives you an idea about how passionate he is into athletics and sport in general.
Can you give an overview of that methodology that you first came upon through his book, and then later through working with him and talking with him? How does he work with his runners?
Yeah, so I think there are a few principles that they stand out from his philosophy. You've got, first of all, the specificity. So with running, it's quite easy compared to other sports because you just have to be mindful about the speed. So if you want to run, let's say, an 800 meters in 1 minute 43, you know that every 200 meters you have to run at that speed. If you want to run a marathon in 2 hours 06:36, you know that you have to run 3 minutes per kilometer, and so forth. So it's very clear the goal that you have and the distance, of course, that you have to cover. And another positive thing about something that makes planning running training a bit easier is that you usually have even-paced races, or if you want to go for a time, probably the best way to do it is evenly paced, except for maybe 800 meters. So the very, very first thing that Renato does is just targeting the race and then say, okay, we know that we can run at this pace, or we aim to run at this pace based on the time we've got and where is your starting point, and then moving backwards from there. So you got your specific target, and then you got the support from the endurance and speed side. So you got, let's say, 5%, speed, specific speed plus minus 5%, and then plus minus 10%, and then plus minus 15%. And that sort of creates a funnel of speeds and intensities that they need to be targeted during the training period. So you want to start off from the extremes, so from the speed and endurance perspective. When we speak about specific workouts, so you still have the easy aerobic exercise just as a aerobic support and maintenance and just easy training, really. But on the other hand, when you look into the workouts, you've got, maybe you start off 20% or 50% slower and faster as targets for your workouts, and then you funnel closer and closer to the race pace as weeks and months move forward. The other thing that he always preaches is you lose what you don't use. So you have this range of speeds, but if you start at 20, plus minus 20%, and then you funnel towards the specificity, you may lose some of the adaptations you've got at the beginning. So from time to time, you still have to go back and give a little bit of stimulus from the speed or endurance side, as well as at the very beginning when you got a very big range of intensities and you're targeting something quite far from the race pace, you still want to have some intensities which are around the race pace. And then what changes over time is the emphasis and the percentage of work you're doing at these intensities. So you're funneling closer and closer to the race pace and having a higher volume of work done at the race pace. And then a couple of other things that you definitely see and they stand out is that you got a change in the density of training. So instead of going, let's say, this classical example he was used to give was, well, you can't expect to get better if you keep doing 10 times 400 meters every week, because that's just going to be the same stimulus. You may get faster, but it's not the optimal way to do it. If instead you start, let's say, with 10 times 400 meters, and then you go 5 times 2 times 400 meters with a short recovery in between the 2 400 meters, that's going to increase the density. And then eventually you may move to 5 times 800 meters, and then you may go for maintaining the same volume. So that's 4 kilometers, and you go maybe 4 times 1 kilometer, and then you reduce the recovery again, and you go 5 times, 2 times 1,000 meters with, let's say, 30 seconds in between and 2 minutes between the sets. And then you go 2 times 2,000 meters and so forth. So that's sort of the idea with any type of development from a workout perspective. So you increase the density instead of just repeating the same workout and hoping that you're getting faster and faster.
How does that does he use that mainly, or so that he basically starts at the target volume already for a given type of workout, or does he also work with increasing the volume of a certain type of workout? Let's say if it is a 10 times 400, would he in some part of the season try to increase that to 12 times 400, 14, 16, and so on?
Yeah, the volume changes as well. It depends on the targets, because when you get, let's say, again, this example of 10 times 400s, you can either move towards having this 4 times 1 kilometer, or you can move to just increase the volume over time. So if you're able to do, let's say, these 5 sets of 800 meters, you'll be able either to go for these 10 sets of 400 quicker, or you can probably do 2 or 3 more because you've been adapting with a different intensity. So you've got that as well. And it really depends on the target. So you can have an increase in intensity given by the increase in speed, if that's your target, or an increase in volume if you need to do that. So with, let's say, marathon training, which is it works quite well. You would start maybe with 6 sets of 3 kilometers at marathon pace, 1 kilometer at, let's say, 90% marathon pace. And then you increase that volume instead of having 18 kilometers at marathon pace, for example, because you need more time to develop the 42 kilometers of the marathon instead of something which is more track related, which can be even longer than the volume of the race itself. So with marathon running, you may just funnel from there all the way to having workouts that can be something like 5 times 5 kilometer, 1 kilometer at the same intensity. So marathon pace and 90% marathon pace, or some other workouts which are even more intense.
Yeah. And on that topic of using it or losing it, that's something that, especially in triathlon, I find is actually really hard, because you still want to, when you still want to do your specific workouts, and you have 3 disciplines that you need to do that in, and then to still be able to fit in the maintenance parameters, basically, or the maintenance type of training, maintaining, let's say, VO2 max or whatever it might be. I'm curious, how does he do it? Does he use it or lose it a couple of different things within the same session, or maybe mix it in with one of the specific sessions, or does he always tend to use a dedicated session already to the quality that he wants to maintain? I'm not sure if I made that question very clear.
Yeah, no, it is very clear, and it is something that it gets tricky. I think one of the main things, again, with Renato, but even with other high-profile coaches, is that they don't think of the training cycle, microcycle, as 7 days block. They stretch it to, let's say, Claudio Berardelli, for example, he stretches it usually to 10 days. Renato can have it up to 21 days. So, of course, you have some workouts, some stimulus that they need to be more frequent than others. So you have to be aware of that. But there's no reason why we have to stick to 7 days programs and targeting always the same goals there. So if you stretch it to 2 weeks, you probably have more room to get these stimulus and different stimuli as well. And yeah, the other thing you mentioned about trying to mix stimulus in the same session, that's also something that he tends to do. So you may have either alternating like something quite speed dominant to something more specific to the race, or on the other hand, just funneling from one intensity to the other. So you start some sort of exercise which is slightly longer and slower, and then you progress quicker and quicker on the track. But yeah, the difficult thing with when you look at Renato's programs, at least when they are out, as in published or just like available online, and is what actually the athletes have been doing, is that they always adjusted based on the situation. So with him being with the athletes during the workouts, he can see if the athlete is coping with it well or not well, and then he adapts the workout as he goes. So you may want to have 10 times 1 kilometer sort of workout, but then the athlete can't cope with the pace, or he needs a bit more recovery. So you may bring it down to 800 meters or 500 meters, and then you may still have the same overall volume, but the number of reps goes up. So if you read it somewhere, it's like, oh yeah, I'll try this workout, but that wasn't necessarily the workout that it was planned for the athlete. The idea was 10 times 1K, but then eventually we had to adapt to the athlete and change the aims because he couldn't cope with the intensity, for example. So
Yep.
I'll carry on. Sorry.
I was going to carry on with the next question, which would be basically: are there things that you do differently in your, or basically principles that you have that are slightly different than in Canova's coaching, or are you following a very similar methodology without any major differences?
Yeah, I think methodology-wise, I can't really comment, because he's been in the game for so long that I've got such a big influence from him that basically my way of programming, at least running programs itself, it is very, very similar. And sometimes we get to talk about differences here and there, but he's always the one giving insights. I think I've got a slight different attitude on other things. So strength training is one of them. We worked together with some athletes, and I supported some of his athletes from a strength training perspective. But his vision is more towards prevention, as we said before, instead of a self-performance enhancement. So he was happy with me having some heavy strength exercises performed, but his view is more like, well, we do it to prevent injuries. I would do a bit more testing, just because, well, Renato, he's got like 40 years, well, more, 60 years. Yeah, probably nearly, let's say, between 55 and 60 years experience in coaching runners. So he's got the eye of the coach, and he knows what a performance means and what a workout means in a performance setting. Whether I don't have that, so I would test athletes a bit more in the lab to, again, just guide a little bit training prescription. And then something that he's not been doing much recently, I think, just because of the fact that he's got so much experience and outcomes from what he's been doing in the past 30 years or so, is he doesn't try as much anymore. He doesn't introduce new things anymore, but I would try to do that. So I would give 5 to 10% of the training prescription based on some new insights that they may be helpful for improving performance.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So now then, I'm asking in light of this, I'm asking you for kind of your thoughts, so we know where you stand. What are some tips that you would give for amateur athletes training for running specifically, and especially for the marathon, because I think that's the one that is so popular for amateur athletes. So if you can give a few marathon training tips for amateur athletes, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. Well, it won't be too different from what we said before, but yeah, it's going to be probably applied to them. And of course, you have differences between high-profile athletes or just elite athletes and amateur athletes due to time constraints and so on. But yeah, keep it simple, first of all. So you can plan it over 7 or 14 day cycle, but you can't really play around with it too much. So you can't allow that much flexibility. So just have something that you can stick to and make sure that you can keep it consistent, basically. Just get your goal, know roughly what your performance can be there, and then walk backwards from there with the specificity and the funneling that we mentioned before. So just make sure that you get enough specific workouts leading up to the race. So one of the big issues you always see with marathon runners is that they do maybe 30 kilometers long runs, but they do it at 80 or 85% of the marathon pace, or 90% of the marathon pace. And then they do 5 times 2,000 meters at or slightly faster the marathon pace. And then they just expect that they can show up to the race and magically merge these two together to have a marathon at the target pace. Well, that rarely happens. So you want to basically get that specific marathon pace and volume developed over time. So that's something that not many people do. And you, as an amateur athlete, you still have to get probably long runs of 32, 35, even 38 kilometers around marathon pace or close to marathon pace. It doesn't necessarily need to be at marathon pace all the time. You can have variations, you can have a progression of speed, but you want to accumulate enough volume at the specific marathon training, at the specific marathon pace in training, basically. Of course, you'll have less overall volume, so you can't expect to do 20 times 1 kilometer, but that's fine. It's just like due to time constraints. I would try to, when looking into basically Renato's philosophy, I would keep in mind the difference that you might have in the time that you have to cover a distance compared to elite athletes. So if you get, I don't know, a long run of 40 kilometers that sometimes elite athletes do, their long run of 40 kilometers may be 1 hour, 2 hours 15, and with you it may well be 3 hours or more. So it's worth keeping that in mind because the load of that long exposure of running, it may create issues, or it may be longer to recover from.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all great points. And one thing actually, this came up on Twitter yesterday. I wasn't even researching for this interview; it just randomly popped up. But somebody posted a quote from Renato saying about the difference in mentality between African runners and European runners. That if I give a workout of 1 hour at 3 minutes per kilometer pace, and it's a bit too hard for the athlete. Basically, what the African runner will do is they will run at 3 minutes per kilometer until they can't run at that speed anymore, whereas the European runner will run a bit slower at the speed that they can hold for 1 hour. So yeah, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Is this something that you've seen as well? And do you think that is there something to learn from that about basically trying to hold the intensity rather than the duration? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it really much aligns with his way of thinking about it, and it's something that I've heard a lot of times from Renato with conversations with other people, and you see it in races as well. You see East African runners just try to keep up with the pace and then eventually dropping out, but they don't really start conservatively. So I think there were a female half marathon runner. I can't remember her name. I think she had the world record recently. That basically she kept on racing half marathons, and initially she dropped out at 20 minutes, and then after 40, and then after 50, and eventually she managed to run the whole race. I think it's two different things, but the difference in attitude there is basically East Africans. They just try to hang on with the group, and they don't really think about it too much. I think Europeans or Americans as well, maybe we just tend to think too much about numbers sometimes. We look at our heart rate, we look at our pace, or I don't know, am I breathing too hard or whatever, and that somehow limits our capacity to perform at times, both in training and racing. So even when you suggest some workouts to athletes, sometimes they're like, "Oh, this is crazy! How can you do it?" And maybe it's the first workout to build a marathon block. So it may be 28 or 30 kilometers at a decent pace. And they go, "Oh, this is not possible. You got to try." So I think, Europeans, they tend to be a bit more not in the comfort zone, but they struggle pushing themselves somewhere that they feel like they won't be able to cope with. And instead of just trying and go for it, they know, oh, I have to run for an hour, so let's try to run an hour. And if I know that I can't cope with that speed, I'm just going to run slower. I think it's just attitude, but specificity. Again, if you have the aim to run eventually a marathon at 3 minutes per kilometer pace, well, you have to get exposed to it. Otherwise, if you just slow it down and hope that you're going to be able to do it in the race, that will not happen.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And one final question on run training. If we talk about run training in a triathlon context, and maybe here we can go back to what, let's say, the elite short course athletes are doing. What are the things that you would say I'm being involved in that setting that translate from running, let's say, and what are the key differences that maybe don't translate so much and that are more specific to triathlon? If we can try to highlight some similarities and differences where they exist.
Yeah, so I want to point out that I'm not a triathlon coach, so I tend to advise coaches on training, running training in triathlon, and again physiology as well. But I usually give some inputs, and then they know how to implement it best because they got the cycling and the swimming as well. So volumes they will be different. So that's one of the things. Usually, triathletes they have to adjust a little bit the volumes because they can't be exposed to such high running volumes. Otherwise, you would take days to recover. So with like a marathon training workout, you may get even 3 or 4 easy days, or like days without workouts after a very specific block of marathon running. and training, but you would never get that in triathlon. So you have to sort of compromise a little bit the volume and the density of the workout due to the demands of other sports. But you want to consider first of all the race demands. So we're speaking about short course triathlon here. You got, the length can vary. So you got either sprint or the Olympic, and therefore that will be different. And the type of race, so is that an athlete that can be in the pack with the bike, and then they try to be with the running at the end and go for the win? Or is it an athlete that actually still needs to improve the bike to get to the final part of the race within the first group or not? Looking into running, that's possibly the last thing you try to build around the triathletes in water and WTCS races at the moment. It's like when you first of all want to be able to be there in the front on the running side, because if you can't be there, then even if you've got a very good run, you won't be able to be in the top positions because the level is just too high at the moment. So you may want to just maintain running if you're a decent or good runner and develop the other qualities. If on the other hand, you're in a situation where your running needs to improve, look at what we said before. So racing demands and like the gaps between your performance and the demands of the race itself. So if you have to run, let's say 3:05 per kilometer and you're running 3:10, how can we get you to run 3:05 from 3:10? And we go back to all the discussion we had before about that specific athletes that, for example, needed to do a little bit more anaerobic and threshold work to get that specificity in. And then one of the other things that you, of course, don't have in running is the run of bike. So like being able to still have a good run of a hard bike ride or just like an intense bike ride as a training session. And that's something that, again, goes into the specificity and you need to develop. So then in training, you may either want to target that as intense bike ride and then develop the run to get slightly quicker over time, or you want to play around with the bike and having it slightly harder or not, depending on the weeks, and maintaining the same run afterwards, for example.
So here you're talking about a brick run, right?
Yes,
implementing brick workouts in training. Okay, yeah. Because that's also an area I feel where there's two schools of thought. I mean, that makes sense because there are two options. You can do them or you cannot do them. But it is quite common to hear quite a few athletes and coaches saying that, they don't really do brick runs. And I think maybe it's more common in long course triathlon, to be honest, because there the speed is a bit lower. So it might make more sense that it's a bit more comfortable, even though now in half distance the speed is really, really high, especially. But yeah, do you feel that in the short course scene? I know you can probably only talk with certainty about the Italians, but do you feel that it's very common that most of the athletes do brick workouts in short course, or can you speak to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to tell. I just got too little data about it. I feel, again, just fitting into that specificity principle, you will want to do it eventually, because the demands of the bike on the short course triathlon now, they're so high that if you're not prepared for it, then you're going to run 1 or 2 kilometers and then just your legs, they're going to leave you. But yeah, I can't really tell how is the training happening at the moment across the board. Sorry about that.
Yeah. No problem. I think we have talked for a long time, and so I think we have to start to wrap it up here. But let's do the rapid fire questions first. And the first one is, what's your favorite book or resource related to endurance sports?
Yeah, it's not endurance sports per se, it's about performance, but it's a book from Steve Magnus and Brad Stolberg, Peak Performance. So it has a lot of examples on endurance performance, and strongly recommended.
And what's an important habit that you've benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
Yeah, I think consistency, really. And you see it in every realm of life. At least I've seen it in every realm of life. Just being able to keep showing up even if things are not going too well or if results are not coming. It's basically just keep hammering that rock and then after 1,000 times it's going to break, sort of thing. So even if results are not there temporarily, that doesn't mean that you don't have an effect over time. And that binds into like just being passionate about what you do as well. So if you don't have the passion to do it or the enjoyment of doing it, then you won't be able to be consistent for long enough to make a difference.
I love that hammering the rock analogy. I haven't heard it, but it's really good. Who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
Yeah, I'm going to name 3 people just because I couldn't really leave any of them out. So I'll get Renato Canova, just because of the influence he had on myself and like the passion he's got and the great person he is. Andy Jones, because again, the influence he's got on sports science and application of it to endurance sports. And I had the chance to be with him recently as well, which has been great. And then Claudio Berardelli, which is a coach in Kenya that is the first one I've done my basically the first exposure of elite performance I've had, and I've learned a lot from him.
Excellent. And finally, where can people follow you and your work?
Yeah, I am on basically just Twitter really at the moment. I can't even remember my handle. It should be at Mick Zanini. But yeah, if you look Michele Zanini there, you'll find it quite easily. I'm not super active, but
it will be in the show notes.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, don't really use Instagram or Facebook much. So yeah, that's not helpful.
All right. Well, yeah, no, but now they have 2 hours of your knowledge on this podcast, so that's a really good start as well. So thank you so much, Michele. I really enjoyed chatting to you, and hope we can do it another time for another couple of hours.
Thank you, Michael. Really enjoyed it, and yeah, apologies, it stretched out a bit too long than expected. Hope it wasn't too long or demanding. Thanks again for having me.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com. Again, there's a whole lot of links to dig into for those interested, both related episodes that I've done with people mentioned throughout this interview on the triathlon show, but also a bunch of papers that were mentioned in passing or in a bit more detail. So lots of links for those interested to dig deeper. Check them out if you are interested. If you want to improve your triathlon performance and want help to achieve your goals, then consider working with a scientific triathlon coach or a training plan. We have options for athletes of all different levels, for different budgets, and no matter the size of your goals. We have no minimum commitment term nor startup fees for coaching, and for the training plans, we have a 100% satisfaction guarantee for plans purchased on our website, and an exchange guarantee so that you can exchange your plan for another plan if you purchase through Training Peaks. We also have consultation and customized plan options, so there's something for everyone. You can find out more and contact us on scientifictriathlon.com, and we can discuss your specific goals and needs and see what's best for you. Just a quick mention, as I also said last week, I have had a few issues with some email servers basically blocking my emails. So there have been inquiries where I have emailed a person back and they haven't received my email because it's blocked or it ended up in the spam folder. And in certain cases, I've been able to find the person anyway, but in others, not so much luck. So if you have sent us an email, an inquiry about coaching or training plans, and you didn't get an answer, it's not because we're ignoring you. This is probably the reason. So in that case, I would suggest just try a different channel, try Instagram or Twitter. Those would be the primary ones that I would recommend. And I'm sure that we can get in touch that way. And hopefully this email issue isn't affecting too many people. I don't think it is, but I do want to mention it in case it has affected any one of you listening. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. If you are looking for electrolytes and fueling products, I would highly recommend trying them out. You can use their free fuel and hydration planner or even a free video consultation with the team to prepare your race strategy. And don't forget to take 15% off your first order with the code TTS23. And thank you to Zen8. Use the Zen8 swim trainer to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. Even if you have just 15 minutes available, you can get a time-efficient Zen8 workout done at home that will help you swim better. You can try the Zen8 risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.